All right, let's go ahead and get started. We can use the time and I'm sure people will be rolling in. Great to see everybody. Nice to have you here. Today's workshop presentation needs no introduction. We have our co-founder and faculty director, Douglas Noonan, presenting today in the workshop. And I'll admit, I'm excited to see what you're going to present, Doug, because even though we're co-authors on a lot of this, I'm curious to see how you put this together. So today, Doug is going to be presenting on work from the on guaranteed income for artists, which primarily comes from the Creatives Rebuild New York program that we evaluated, which was a guaranteed income program for artists in New York State that was run starting in 2022 as a pilot and had about 2,400 individuals in it. And we collected a lot of interesting data that I think Doug is going to start to talk more about, but probably have a larger, broader conversation, I'm guessing, on guaranteed income in general. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Douglas Noonan, and we will, like always, take questions at about half past and have I'm sure, a great conversation. All right, Doug, take it away.
Thanks, Joanna. Hello, everyone. I normally get to sit on the other side of this in a way and sort of help moderate and not have to present stuff. But this is exciting for me to actually get to share my screen and show you some stuff. So let me start by doing that. And the big picture of this talk is, it's what we've learned so far about guaranteed income for artists, specifically through the Creatives Rebuild New York program. I'll give you a little background on that. We've done a bunch of different, research briefs and now academic papers, half dozen of these things so far, and trying to squeeze in a half dozen papers in 20 minutes or so. The good news is it's not only impossible to do, but it means I'm not going to wade into any of the technical details and all of this. We're not going to sweat standard deviations and control variables and all of that, but I'm happy to talk about all of that. I'm going to try to keep this a little high level, and I think that's going to help with the conversation in the second half, because I suspect we'll have some interesting things to say. And I'll also say that while most of this talk is sort of big picture, I'll try to get into some of the little details about it. But this big picture piece is, I don't know, it's fairly anodyne. It's fairly, I think, sort of uncontroversially straightforward, as we're going to see. And I think there's actually a lot beneath the surface that's less straightforward. And I'm probably not going to say almost any of that. I'm going to wait for you to ask me questions to get me to say something provocative in the second half. So that's your challenge as the listener. Uh, so to go through this, for CRNY, Creators Rebuild New York, this was a 3-year, $125 million initiative to support artists across New York State, although most of them were in New York City. Uh, we were looking at the Guaranteed Income for Artists part program that CRNY ran, which was a guaranteed income payment, $1,000 a month, unconditional, no strings attached. They got $1,000 a month for a year and a half. They selected 2,400 artists out of approximately 10 times the number who applied for this funding. So they allocated sort of winning lottery tickets on a weighted lottery. So Sierra and I did this nice weighted lottery and then brought us in to say, hey, can the Center for Cultural Affairs help us with evaluating the impact? Because not only is this a massive program, but we want to learn from it. So we came in essentially as the lead for the research evaluation team, and we also partnered with another team that had researchers from Appalachian State, NYU, WashU, and St. Louis. And this helped us embrace a bunch of different perspectives and different windows on how to evaluate it. It wasn't meant to be just one story or one perspective or one narrative. We wanted to look at a lot of stuff. And Joanne and I had our particular interest in trying to understand who these artists are, how they worked, how they lived, and how sort of precarity interacted with guaranteed income. Uh, the idea for CRNY in their guaranteed income for artists program, it wasn't just any old artist in New York State. They had to be under a self-sufficiency standard in terms of income. They weighted things based on a bunch of other demographic factors. And we'll get into those in the next slide. But this, I wanted to mention also for people who might not care about New York State, and I wouldn't blame you for that necessarily. And this one particular program is a rather particular program, but I think this is all a lot bigger than this one, actually really big program. There's a lot of money, a lot of artists, and so we can learn a lot from that. But I think it's much bigger than that. If this is guaranteed income is now certainly a live policy topic. It's also so in addition to just guaranteed income as a thing, it's worth learning from this research because artists are particularly interesting. Their precarity is not all that unique, and they help make a lot of precarity visible. They're sort of a bellwether for a lot of the gig economy, and so there's that's a bit of a piece. There's also in the arts world a big piece about who counts as artists, what counts as work. And this particular population that was served by the Guaranteed Income Program can tell us a lot about some of the more marginalized artists and harder to capture and observe artists out there. And so this project brings together cultural policy, social policy, labor policy, it brings together a lot of different things in a post-pandemic environment, but also, one of the reasons why guaranteed income is a hot topic nowadays outside of the arts is this sort of idea of an emergent AI economy putting us all on the dole sitting on a couch all day. And so maybe we can learn before we get to that point from this project. So in doing all of this, there are a number of research briefs you can go and get. We'll put in the chat if it's not already there, a bunch of links to find these kinds of things. So these were the initial research briefs. These are over a year ago. And all of these things are very user-friendly, written for a lay audience. And so you can download those PDFs easily and look through it. I would not personally put all the weight of the world on these things anymore. Those were really early days, and the much more rigorous and more intensive research is what I'll spend the next 20 minutes talking about, and it's going to continue to emerge. Those things are also going to be much harder to read without a graduate degree. These things are user friendly. Also, in the lower right corner here is the data dump from the CRNY, essentially, where we're hosting it up on our artsanalytics.org platform. So you can go and look at the microdata, the actual individual responses to a big survey with thousands of respondents. And that's on the right-hand side of this slide, where the portrait of New York State artists, the survey, 13,000 respondents to a bunch of different questions. Some of these people were in the Guaranteed Income for Artists program, some were in a different program, some didn't win the lottery, but they're in the database. So we can learn a lot about a wide set of artists in New York State from that. The two other links on the left are a couple other pieces we've written for more general public, essentially blog posts. And again, links for all this stuff should be in the chat. So now I want to talk more about the sort of research arc and where it's been going and where it'll go next. And we've got a half dozen papers here that have been published in the last few months or will be forthcoming. And I'm going to go through each of these and give you a big picture overview of what they say. But you can tell just from the little taglines here, first little bits thinking about who these artists are, who participated, who did we find, who did they find in this program, how does this overlap with other social safety net programs? But then generally, well, so what's the impact of guaranteed income on the supply of labor, on the amount artists work and how they work? What's the effect of this on their career development, professional development? What's the effect of this on their well-being and sort of flourishing, as you might call it? So this first paper, who are the artists? And you can get this paper published in a journal called Cultural Trends. And here we compare the Guaranteed Income for Artists program participants with the artists that would normally be caught in federal big national databases like the Current Population Survey, the CPS. And you can see that the Guaranteed Income for Artists program, artists don't really look at all like what shows up in the federal statistics. And this is for a couple reasons. One, because they were trying their eligibility criteria meant that they had to be New York State artists age 18 and up and needed to be having an income below a self-sufficiency standard. So we're already lopping off the top part of the income distribution and looking at people who are on the low income side. But also their weighted lottery weighted things towards BIPOC artists, towards transgender, multigendered artists, towards rural artists and immigrant artists and artists in the LGBTQI plus community, artists who identified in other ways. So there's criminal justice involved. There were 9 different criteria to get at more vulnerable and marginalized artists. And so lo and behold, the GIA artists pool looks a lot different than what our national pool of generally terribly white and pretty well off and very well educated artists look like. The GIA artists were definitely skewed much more towards that voluntary, or sorry, that marginalized and vulnerable part of the society. The right-hand side shows a little Sankey chart where we're taking the disciplines, the artistic disciplines as described in the federal databases, that'd be the right-hand side, and sort of based on occupation codes. And then on the left-hand side, the different categories that CRNY used to talk about the sort of the disciplines of artists. And they had things like oral traditions, where that doesn't show up as an occupation code, right? So it's interesting to see how these things map onto each other. But it's more interesting, big picture, is just this gives us a different lens to think about who artists are and what their practice looks like, and not making it conform to the same old occupation codes that we use in our federal databases. Now you can see that it looks a little bit, there's a different way to look at a similar sort of thing. All right. The second paper, which is just came out in Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly, is looking at sort of social safety net questions and how much this guaranteed income program, with its priority criteria, its eligibility criteria, and it's targeting artists, how does that map onto the population that is already receiving uh, other public assistance and other sort of social safety net programs. And in this study, we tried to look at, well, does being on public assistance mean you're more likely to be getting this guaranteed income program because you're qualified for public assistance, thus you're kind of poor and all of that. And you can see if sort of from the headline results here, out of about 22,000 eligible applicants, these are the people who applied for the guaranteed income program. About 26% of the selected artists, the ones who sort of won the lottery, only about a quarter of them actually said that they were already getting public assistance. Uh, Even though more than 70% were below this self-sufficiency standard, but also not on public assistance. So most of the recipients of this were absolutely poor, but not receiving government help, essentially. And, or at least not reporting that they were receiving government help. And then once we controlled for how the lottery was weighted, and you can see in the lower right corner all the 9 different categories for their priority criteria that CRNY used. Once you control for all this, basically, whether you were on public assistance or not didn't help your odds of winning this lottery. It was really just driven by those criteria. And those criteria, in large part, are correlated in many cases with receiving public assistance, but certainly not perfectly so. And in general, what we find for doing this analysis is that this guaranteed income program, as it was set up and implemented, was really supplementary to our normal prior public assistance programs, that there was relatively little overlap. And to the extent that there was actually overlap, there were concerns that, eligibility would be at risk. If you received guaranteed income, you might stop being eligible for the public assistance. And CRNY bent over backwards to mitigate those problems and make sure that people were not going to be losing their assistance, their public assistance by participating in the program. But in a sense, there was not a very common problem across their population because these were for sort of at need, at risk, marginalized populations who weren't already getting public assistance for whatever reason. All right. And I occasionally get a little pop-up on my screen here saying there's another chat in the chat room, or another comment in the chat room, which means there's questions piling up, I suspect. And I'm just happy that Joanna's going to feed them to me later. Okay. So next paper is, full disclosure, my favorite one, and it's just accepted at the Journal of Cultural Economics. And this is our labor market supply, sort of our labor supply paper. And there's obviously the big narrative that's not specific to artists, that guaranteed income or universal basic income is going to mean people can just sit at home on the couch and watch TV all day and not work. And in a sense, we wanted to go out and test that simple question. Does receiving the guaranteed income mean that they were less likely to work, or they worked less, or something like that? But we were actually more interested in this, I think, from a deeper theory perspective, in that long ago, at least cultural economists have theorized that artists may often be following what essentially is termed a work preference model. The idea behind the work preference model is that once you get to a subsistence level of income and you make enough money to sort of pay the rent and put food on the table, artists don't generally practice that craft to make more money. They practice the craft for practicing the craft's sake. And so there's this idea that if you gave them more money, they won't, or you raised their wages or something like that, they're not going to go out and work more beyond that subsistence threshold. They're going to get to the subsistence threshold, and then to the extent that they can, they'll work more in producing art, whether it makes money or not is not the primary concern. And it's an interesting idea that artists are sort of less motivated by money and more motivated by the opportunity to practice their craft. It's a nice idea, but it's actually pretty hard to test in the field. It's hard to test out in the real world because we don't have very favorable conditions usually to see whether or not moving people up to the subsistence level affects the amount of work they do. Do they cut back on work and so on? And so this program actually gave us a great chance to test the pretty basic theory about artistic labor. And the headlines, which you've already had a chance to see by now, is that on average, those who received the guaranteed income program worked about 4 hours a week more on what was termed artistic work. And for this, in the survey, actually, let me pause for a second, take a step back about some of the data we had here. So at the 18-month mark, when they were finishing up the program, the guaranteed income program, we surveyed everybody in the program and said, answer a bunch of these questions about your labor and your well-being and so on. We also surveyed as many of the non-winners of the lottery that we could. So eligible applicants who were in the lottery but did not get selected for the program. We followed up with them 18 months later also and asked them the same questions. So we have a nice control group and a randomly selected treatment group, which is a really pretty lovely design for coming up with rigorous treatment effects here. And so this 4 hours a week of extra or additional artistic work is relative to what the control group was reporting changed in their artistic work, or was what the amount of time they spent on artistic work. So about 4 hours a week more relative to an average of about 19.4 hours a week of artistic work. They kicked that up by about 4 hours. We asked them about their work in three different categories: their artistic work, their arts related work, maybe it's teaching art, maybe it's doing marketing, maybe it's doing admin work related to their artistic practice, and then non-arts related work, which I just refer to as working at Target. So they had these three types of work, and there was no significant change in their arts related work, an increase in their arts work, and a decrease in their non-arts work by about 2.5 hours. Both those were statistically significant. If we look at the amount of earnings they had or reported from their non-arts related earnings, that went down by about $4,000. And overall, their total earnings also on average went down, but it was interesting because this almost $12,000 decline in total earnings for an annualized earnings was not statistically significant. The impact on total earnings was really very noisy and all over the place between the treatment and the control group. So what is a fairly large average effect is not statistically significant. It's also worth noting, at least to me, that about $12,000 a year reduction in annual earnings is exactly the same amount as the guaranteed income program of $1,000 a month for 12 months would be. So in a sense, their net income on average didn't change, but it's hard to say that there's a really significant treatment effect. The bottom line here is that artists, when given a bunch of unconditional money, worked as much, if not more, in terms of total hour. They just shifted from non-arts work to arts work on average. Now, that doesn't mean that each individual artist made that shift, but on average, they increased the amount of arts work and decreased their non-arts work. And in the process, shifting from non-arts work to arts work did not increase their income at all. If anything, it decreased it. So this is our sort of big headline story, which is there's none of this story about, oh, you give them a bunch of free money and they'll stop working. If anything, they work more. They just got to do what they wanted to do, which is work on arts. And so the work preference model has actually passed this pretty clean test. And it, in a sense, it passed with flying colors. It's really an interesting result. Okay, next paper. This one's forthcoming. I think it's in Poetics. Joanna will correct me. And this one, we looked at a battery of questions about professional development that we asked them. So we asked them things like, how much do you, in the last month, do you think you're experimenting doing more experimental work with your art? Are you using art to, develop your skills? How do you rate the quality of your work? How do you rate the perceived impact your work is having? And we asked this again for the treatment and for the control group. So this wasn't asking artists, do you think that the guaranteed income program has meant you experimented more or has improved your impact? We just asked them about their artistic practice and how's it going. And we asked the control group, how's it going? And across these basic metrics of how much do you experiment in the last month? Have you developed your skills? What's your perceived quality? What's your perceived impact? All of them showed a fairly sizable, like half a standard deviation, a third of a standard deviation impacts of it as far as a treatment effect goes on increasing all of these sort of professional development pieces. One of the other ones is, are you doing community-based work? And there was a fairly small but still significant increase in the amount of artists who are doing community-based work who were in the program. Among the participants, though, we also asked them, have you applied for any grants or awards? And also separately, have you won any grants or awards? And there was not much of a significant effect there. If anything, they might be applying to more. There's a little marginal, a statistical significant and a small effect there. But uh, even if it did go up that they were applying to more grants and awards, it hasn't translated into wins yet. We'll see. But this is all just within 18 months of starting this program. In general, they report that the trajectory of their own career is going up, and in the sense that they're reporting that more often than the control group was reporting, and they're less often reporting that their career was trending down relative to the control group. So professional development wise, at least in terms of self-reported uh, impacts on professional development, receiving the guaranteed income has been good for them. All right, next paper, which just came out, I don't know, this last month in World Development Perspectives, maybe in April, maybe this month, was looking at stories of sort of broadly speaking, this sort of human flourishing. And, we see there's increases in the satisfaction they have with their own work. There are increases in the amount of their perceived impacts. There's mental and relational flourishing. We asked them a bunch of mental health and well-being questions. Across the board, these are all really positive. I'm going to get to new results on that in a second. They're saying, more community engagement. They're paying their bills better. They've got more ability to save for emergencies and so on. And rather than talk about this sort of big overview of flourishing paper, I want to talk about some analyses that I ran yesterday. So hot off the press. This is the first time I'm seeing them, I think. So this is where we took the battery of well-being and sort of mental health type questions, as well as some other things like ability to pay the bills or be able to afford time to practice your art. And we looked at those items in the surveys to say, what's the treatment effect? How is the treatment group, those receiving the guaranteed income, performing relative to that control group? And it's kind of interesting in the sense that it's not interesting. It's like really consistent across the board positive effects. The little numbers on the right-hand side are all the effects in terms of the standard deviation of this metrics, which are usually like 5-point scales. And so we're looking at about a third, 25% to a third of a standard deviation as the impact of receiving the guaranteed income on all sorts of things like their own agency, their optimism, their mental health, their ability to feed themselves, their ability to find meaning in their work, the social relations, and then sort of other versions like, how much apathy do you feel? How worried are you? How depressed are you? Positive impacts on these batteries of things across the board. Their ability to pay utilities. Like you get to like more like logistical day-to-day stuff. Again, this is all self-reported, but we're looking at, 5% or better able to pay rent. It should be worth noting that maybe like a 5% increase in your ability to pay rent is perhaps giving everyone $1,000 a month. If that only moves the needle for 5% of people, either a lot of people weren't all that marginal about being able to pay rent, or apparently $1,000 isn't doing enough. So maybe these effect sizes aren't as big as one would want or expect. That's a good conversation to have. But in terms of sort of well-being results across the board, positive and significant. The only ones where we didn't really see any positive effects are on things like, are you debt-free? $1,000 a month was not enough to move the needle on getting people debt-free. Are you getting payday loans? where not many people were doing that, and $1,000 a month didn't really change that. Do you have health insurance because of this? It also didn't affect health insurance rates, which I should say, even with this population, a very high share of them had health insurance. Maybe that won't be true in 2026 and beyond, but at the time, again, this program started in 2022, paying people off. Uh, the insurance take-up rates were over 85%, I think. So not moving the needle on that. There wasn't a lot to increase. So across the papers, sort of same mechanism, same story keeps showing up. You raise the income floor, and there's less survival pressure, and so artists can essentially say no to some of their non-arts work and yes to more of their arts work. Uh, that gives them more agency, more time to do practice, to get to do their craft. They get to experiment more. Their skill development reportedly goes up, and they get on better, at least mental health trajectories, and start moving the way that one would expect and hope. And in that sense, this is a pretty boring presentation because lo and behold, giving artists a bunch of free money made their lives better in kind of almost all the obvious ways one would expect. I think it's important to put some limitations in here. Like this is not a general population study. This is about a very select group of people. I mean, there were only 22,000 of them who volunteered to be in this category in New York State. So it's not that rare. There's a lot of people here that are in the broader population, but this doesn't generalize necessarily outside of this sort of marginalized group. It came right after COVID, or maybe even in the tail end of it. And so there's a recovery period, and some of that is happening for everybody, treatment and control during this time. And the intervention and all this data analysis was for an 18-month period. And in theory, they should have all known that right after we gave them this survey, they were going to get cut off. They'd been told over and over again that this is coming to an end. Uh, so there's a big question about all these nice positive effects. If we came back a year later, are they all miserable again? Are they all back working at Target again? How temporary were these benefits and these impacts? How long did it take to snap back to the way it was before? Or did this set them in new trajectories and put them on new paths? And even when you took the cash infusion away, they were off and soaring. And we just don't know. CRNY by design sunsetted shortly after writing the last check, which I think might have been to us to do the evaluation. But right after closing down that 18-month program, CRNY sunsetted, and so had no funding and no program to continue following up with these artists over the long haul. And that's a big miss, I think. So as I wrap this up, I'm going to get done almost before 12:30, which would be great. We got a couple more papers in the works. That first one is looking at cost of living. It was a flat $1,000 a month, whether you lived in Manhattan or in Syracuse or in the boonies. And so cost of living varied widely across the contexts of the recipients. And that's something we want to look at to see if there's an interesting story there. And there's some initial results we've got, but that's something we're going to dig into to see if we can learn something from what is a sort of real purchasing power difference in the amount of cash being transferred. I'm also later this year going to be cooking up a study to look at the impact of the cash transfer and the impact of this guaranteed income program on geographic mobility. These artists moved around a bit. They weren't a very sedentary population to begin with, and when you give them $1,000 a month, did some of them get to quit their bad roommates, go pick up new roommates, move to Detroit? I don't know. So we're going to look at mobility side of things as one of the next questions we'll ask. And we're continuing to look for resources to fund a longer term follow-up study to see what the more long-term impacts are of this kind of work. So bottom line, CRNY, guaranteed income program, very specific thing in some ways, but I think it's a vivid case to look at a lot of other big questions. Big thanks to CRNY because them putting in the groundwork to make a really rigorous evaluation possible was essential. We weren't involved at the ground floor. We came in after they've already run the lottery and done all this, but they collected some important information and they randomized it, and that makes all the difference. And they gave us access to that control group of failed applicants. The strongest results throughout all of this are really not generally about labor or certainly about earnings. and income. It's not about their ability to get out of to make themselves ineligible so that they wouldn't be under the self-sufficiency standard of income. We don't have reason or evidence right now to say that it helped get people over the bar in terms of the money side of things, but it did give them opportunity to spend more time on their art, to get agency over their art, to experiment more, and so on. We have some nice confirmation of the work preference model, which I'm excited about. And we still need to do more longer term follow up. So, with that, I want to open it up for some questions. I see there's only 19 things in the chat I haven't seen yet. So, whew,
Many of those are
where,
mine, but
well,
I
where are
mean,
we at, Joanne?
there are still questions. So thanks, Doug. That was perfect timing too. You must have done this before. Um, so let's start with Mel's question. Can you anticipate any generalizability to any subpopulations and on what bases?
Well, I mean, strictly speaking, that's a trap of a question. So no, of course not. No, when I answer any of these questions, I'm gonna hope but be disappointed that Joanna can come in and correct any of my bad answers or improve on them. So please do, Joanna. But I expect you're gonna leave me out to answer these, which is fair. So generalizability, seriously, I think, and it's a it is a big question. I I think we can, in some ways, generalize. In part, I can want to generalize to the broader population of the 22,000 applicants. So the rest of the sort of marginalized New York State artists. Now, would I generalize beyond that? Uh, I would, probably because I'm going to be sort of lazy and desperate. Combination of the two factors. And that's not much of a basis for generalization, but we just don't have this kind of rich data on other populations uh, to be able to enjoy the convenience of not generalizing. It's really hard to resist that temptation. The nice part is we have a lot of baseline control variables. We know a lot about their demographics. We know about a lot of observables that we can generalize if we can match and weight based on those sorts of observables. So I think as long as we've got a lot of observables and we can do some other sort of internal validity checks to see whether or not uh, that's going to be give us reason to think that that's sufficient. I think we can generalize. The biggest concern where I wouldn't be generalizing is I definitely wouldn't generalize from these marginalized populations to ones that are more economically successful and wealthier. I think we've got very little reason to think that any of these results will generalize to more economically successful artists.
Yeah, just my
Yeah.
quick tag onto that, Doug, would be looking at income support programs, grant programs for uh, other not underprivileged or income uh, unreliable populations, sort of in general, like the Finnish income support program and some of those of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, it is really interesting also, like generalizing, my first thought goes to like the nature of the sort of demographics. You could also be generalizing based on geography. Like would this be a similar story if you did it in LA or Des Moines? And I'm not sure there's something special about New York. There is obviously something special about New York City, but I'm not sure. But this other one about generalizing to sort of other programs, other kinds of support, whether they're grants or other things. The initial thought is we shouldn't. And my other initial thought is one of the interesting parts of guaranteed income is this no strings attached business. The premise is that people are going to take the money and do crazy, weird stuff with it. If they were going to all do predictably similar stuff, we wouldn't give them unrestricted cash. We would just buy them that thing or do that thing for them. The premise here is that we want people to have the freedom to do weird stuff. And in that sense, it's kind of interesting to think about finding treatment effects when we're expecting heterogeneity. We're expecting 24,000 different responses. And I think then what can we learn about any particular program that isn't so unrestricted and what can it tell us? In that sense, maybe very little. And then I'll end my last thought on this before we get other questions, and we can come back with time. I think there's another interesting part about this related to like a grant program in that almost all of the qualitative work that Joanna and I did in talking and communicating with participating artists is they thought this was a grant program. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm saying that bluntly, it's inaccurate. Technically, what I just said is wrong, but there was very much an explicit sense and sometimes explicit language used that they saw this as a grants program. It really helped us with our response rate for our survey because they thought if they played nice with CRNY, that CRNY would keep giving them money. They thought that there was a relationship there that might help them continue to receive money like any grantee would. Even though CRNY sunsetting and there were no strings attached, they were invented in the minds of the recipients. And so in some ways this might have be able to tell us more about other grants sort of programs than it should, because these guys kind of imagined that it was like a grant program.
Also, a great question. Do you know of any guaranteed income programs that are for a broader population, but designed targeted with artists in mind? It would be interesting and helpful to see whether artists benefit differently or disproportionately. And I went ahead and I posted in we did a literature review of other pilot programs that have been conducted since the COVID-19 pandemic. And in that literature review, you can actually see a summary of all of the different outcomes that have been tested in these different pilots and in what direction the effects have been. And so you could see do a little bit of a comparison there.
But those
Um,
aren't artists programs.
no, they're not artist programs. Absolutely. I don't know of any large scale programs that we've been able to do comparative work between, but it is a good question
It's a
for
great one.
sure.
And Minneapolis sort of springboards arts program. This is not looking for any old artists. It's targeted. The Irish basic income for artists program is also targeted. It'll be a hard sell to say um, that we want to have Tom Cruise eligible for one of these guaranteed income things. And so, but without opening it up to, middle class artists, we won't be able to know what
Yeah.
what the effect is.
And we have somebody from Ireland. So they say, Annette says we're about to embark on round two of our basic income program. And she's wondering about the positivity bias and how that impacts on people's responses.
Yeah, great question. I don't. So we have some, actually, in a sense, administrative data in that we were able to collect banking data on these artists. And Joanne and I have both sort of sworn off of this and that we don't want to use it. We didn't ask for it. We thought it was more information than we wanted to have about these people. We want to let them have their privacy. But that would give us some sort of objective external evidence that we might be able to squeeze some evidence about positivity bias or any kind of response bias. We haven't done that yet. My sense from this is it's a very real risk, especially if they're imagining in their minds that this is a grant type situation. They have all the incentive in the world to report fabulous status and fabulous outcomes. Uh,
Hmm.
and and yet we also have a control group who when asked the same questions might feel a little jilted, feel a little unhappy that they were in the control group essentially, and they may be giving a different kind of answer that is also got that sort of self-reported bias. And so this could be exaggerating some of the effects we're seeing. I think it's less likely to happen on some of these other like hours worked types of questions, but it could still be there for sure. One piece that this reminds me to plug that we're going to be looking into, it'll probably be in the latter half of this year. We did do a 3 month follow-up because CRNY had not turned the lights off yet. So we were able to do a 3 month follow-up 3 months after they were off the program and not receiving checks anymore. We didn't ask the full battery of questions. We asked a lot of them again. And I think that might give us a sense of some of this bias, but the problem is it's also going to conflate whether they're going to be differently honest now that they're not receiving checks versus what are the effects of not receiving checks. And so to be able to disentangle those is going to be problematic at best. But it's a great question, and I honestly think so. This is one of the advantages of like the what was it? What's the name of the open GI, the Sam Altman funded work
Mhm.
that getting more administrative and more objective measures on these kinds of things is really important because I think the response bias and trying to be the sort of social desirability piece is going to be huge. I'm very wary of it.
Mhm.
Yeah. Can I
Uh,
just follow up on that to say that I mean, obviously, the funding landscape in Ireland and Europe is very different than it is in the States. And after the initial round of basic income concluded here, there was a huge backlash against our minister for cutting people off, even though
Mm.
everybody knew there was a termination date.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so there definitely was a positivity bias in my view, and it's a personal view, even though we reviewed the first policy. Um, and there is a kind of a systemic disappointment around this, where people are buying into a fantasy of what the basic income scheme can offer, while not being really honest about the disappointment around the thousands who are not being selected for it. So there is a question about whether or not there is this politics of gratitude around it, and an optimism bias that I don't think is necessarily being picked up in the research that's around it so far, but
Yep.
maybe your research or research that's coming down the line will address that in some way.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you mentioned it. It's big. And it's fascinating also because part of it's how do you avoid it and even how you detect it from the research side is tricky. And especially because we're not designing these programs to get like a control group that is also receiving a much lower level of money, but might still have that positivity bias where you can sort of fight fire with fire by a control group that's been favorably
Mm.
treated. We just haven't been doing that on the arts program side.
Mm. I want to go to Michael's question and then I'll come back to the chat and then I'll go to Neil's question, doing a little toggling.
What do you got, Michael?
Thank you, Joanna. Doug. So I I have a problem with these kinds of programs. And it stems from this. So if these had never been invented and somebody came to me in a policy shop and said, we want to have this guaranteed income for artists. And I said, well, what do you think is going to happen? And they said, well, this is a pure income effect. I remember from Econ 101. So we expect that the people who get this money, their welfare will go up and that they will probably supply less labor to target style jobs and spend more time on other stuff, right? If I were still teaching Econ 101, that's what you would expect. And I'd say, okay. And so I'd say, well, what's the goal of this program? And then the respondent says, well, that is the goal. So in other words, this is a program where the means and the ends are essentially the same. Our goal is to give artists money, and our means to do that is to give artists money, right? And we expect these things will happen. But you can't evaluate that. I mean, in that sense, there's no way this program could fail, right? We went out to give artists money and we did, and it had
Yep.
predicted effects. So it seems to me, at least at this point, there's no way to do real policy analysis on was this money well spent? Because there's no comparison point. It had, as you yourself said, fairly predictable effects on what it was going to do. But there's no way to say, well, was that worth it? And it's an odd arts policy that says, well, this is going to be our goal, is just to give them money. I can't think of any other policy domain where you would do this. The question of a universal basic income is, to my mind, an entirely separate question because it is universal, right? And a UBI is meant to achieve particular things where you could say, well, this is our goal. We want to lower sort of the administrative burdens of all these different kinds of income support, put them all into one, all these kinds of things. But that's a very different thing from what was done here. So I'm wondering, I know this is really long-winded, but I'm sorry. I'm just wondering, are we going to see actual policy analysis of whether these programs are good? I keep seeing reports out of Ireland, for example, oh, the program was wildly successful because the artists liked it and they made some more art. But that's not a measure of success because it's not really comparing it to all of the alternative ways to devote funds to the arts. And there's many, many different ways to do it. So I'll just let you respond to that ramble there.
I like it. I like the ramble. And I want to say thank you, especially Michael, for that, because then I didn't have to do that ramble. And it's better you're saying that than I am, because I'd rather people throw tomatoes at you than me. But I sympathize. And I think it's interesting in that the sort of Econ 101 of this all was borne out in these data. That said, you could have screwed this policy up where the whole policy's goal is to give them money and you went out and gave them money and thus it's going to work. Because some of these artists are really hard to give money to, it turns out. They're hard to work with in a lot of ways. Like, there is no gift certificate or gift card you could give them to fill out a survey that would not offend some of them or not be possible. We had several of them say that they can't receive Amazon. They can't, Amazon doesn't deliver to them. They live in New York State and apparently Amazon won't deliver. Uh, like it's a weird population. It's possible they could have screwed up the basics. But yeah, it's an interesting case. So I think we're going to put out something that is more policy analytic about this, in part by putting it up against the Irish example, and specifically the cost benefit analysis that was done for the Irish case, which I think is not just flawed, it's problematic in a number of deep levels. That said, I think the real impacts of this, if you were to look for, and actually you have to invent your own sort of policy goals, because the stated ones aren't the stated ones, but this idea of long-term impacts of just letting somebody catch their breath for 18 months might empower them to do things that they couldn't otherwise do because of perhaps liquidity constraints or something, right? And we could study that. The problem is that we're not, because we don't have the longitudinal follow-up. But I think that's where you could see maybe this upfront investment, much like, say, early childhood development investment, might have really big long-term gains for society. And we need to follow up to be able to show that. The I mean, there's other pieces you can pick into on this, with something like their ability to win awards or apply for more grant funding, where we didn't move the needle. That might be something to look at. The fact that they're shifting more to their arts work, but well, all right. And then the last thing I'll say on this is I think this is not I'm not a big fan of guaranteed income programs from a policy perspective for a number of reasons, most of which you just said. But that's why I like this project, because I can learn a lot about things that aren't about guaranteed income programs. And so helping somebody with a positive income shock or reducing their precarity for a bit, I can see how they change their behavior. Regardless of how they got to that point, I enjoy seeing that changed behavior. And I think it's really interesting to see that essentially giving up the Target jobs, giving up working at the grocery store or waiting tables, I guess is the cliche, to go and work on your craft doesn't pay off for these people, at least not in the short run. They're leaving money on the table to go do their craft. And is that a sign that the arts are too high volatility, too high risk, too uncertain to get that payoff, unlike waiting tables or working at Target? Is it a sign that they're actually not very good artists, that the market doesn't really like what these guys are doing? And that's partly why they're eligible for this in the first place. And they're better off at waiting tables than they are at arts. I think all of that's really interesting to look at. And so I think some of the best things we get out of this are less about the policy and more about the behavioral issues going on the ground.
That being said, so Anne had a question and it's related to this. And so maybe you can just expand a little bit on the cost benefit analysis. So she asks, will there be an inquiry into broader economic impact and how this program affected it? And is it possible to measure this? So could you just expand it a tad?
Yeah. So this is interesting part on the inside, working with CRNY and all this, and actually talking to the people at NEA, for instance. They're really excited about giving money to artists and watching how artists then give that money away to other people and start spending money and help the people around them, their community. They start hiring other artists to work on their projects. And there's a big interest in seeing the sort of economic impact that artists have around them. And I have yet to see that translate into evidence. And part of it is from what we've got, 2,400 artists scattered around New York State. I've got no optimism and no mechanism for me to be able to see any economic impact from them. I'm not sure you would actually be able to see it, but even if you could, we don't have the data. Either there aren't enough of them or they're just not going to be, it's not enough money to see that. We have some questions in the survey of like, how did you spend your money? But we also don't have that for the control group because they didn't get the GI money to ask. So it's real hard to measure. I get the impetus and the interest in the question. that a lot of people, maybe not, it may not be yours, Anne, which is fine, but that I hear that people really want to be able to show that artists are sort of spending and supporting other people. Um, I would just need a different research program to get at that. This is not, unfortunately, I think this is not going to help us enough with that.
No, I think
I wish it could.
yeah, no, awesome. And thank you very much for your response. I work in local government, so it's often how can I quantify this? How can I say how this benefits us economically? So that was the impetus for my question. Thank you.
No,
Super informative. Thank you.
it's great. Great question.
I'm going to be super efficient for the last 10 minutes. We'll have Neil ask a question. Then we also have Tal, but I also want to finish the session with Professor Conrad's question from the class. So that will be the last question. So Neil.
All right. First thing, Doug, I want to defend New York State. As a native of New York State, your first statement was kind of offensive. So who
I'm from
cares about New
Chicago.
York?
You gotta take it.
Too bad. You know, it's a great state to have grown up in, not New York City to grow up in. So I just wanted to defend that. Second comment, I didn't hear you mention anything about other family members' income. Was that collected as part of the survey? And if not, why not? I mean, it can behave in many ways like the guaranteed income. It's
Yeah.
it goes to the household instead of to this
If-
individual.
Yeah, totally. No, we did ask questions about household income. There's not a lot of questions in there, but we asked, what were your earnings from arts work and non-arts work and arts related work? And then we also asked, what's your total household income? But we don't have questions in this survey about like, are you receiving money and how much money are you receiving from family members? And actually, and part of this is because in this population and working with CRNY, the notion of household and family was problematic and challenging in a good way. But there's a lot of very mixed sort of households. And so broaching that in a quick survey was difficult. So we ended up going with a pretty simple one of what's your household income? Joy and I are doing some other stuff to try to get at other forms of support for artists, but it's not going to be connected to the guaranteed income.
Just one last comment or question. Did you control in any way for where these people were living? New York State is a very bifurcated state. New York City is liberal and democratic. Everything outside of New York City is Republican and quite conservative. I know this because for many years I've been visiting my in-laws up in upstate New York, and they are very different than those people who live in New York City. And they're very different in how they would treat the receipt or even think about going after government grants or some kind of grants to support themselves. It seems if you haven't controlled for that, I think the confounding problem, of course, was during this period of the study, lots of New York artists moved out of New York because they couldn't afford any longer to their studios or whatever, and moved to upstate New York and really felt uncomfortable. And now we're seeing them really wanting to get rid of what they did where they were living during that short period that your study was, and moving back into the city.
Right. Great points. We did control for the geography piece a bit. It was surprising in some ways to me, and it's worth saying, like, whatever, 75, 80% of them were in New York City. And so, which is not surprising given the population and the mass of New York State, but it's also a little surprising. The median income was something like $22,000 a year, and you live in New York City on $22,000 a year. And so maybe doing that bit about positivity bias, like there's some people they verified incomes on people, but I do not underestimate this population's ability to be creative with their accounting and finances and how that shows up and how that interacts with what a household means. And I think all of that is something I would love to be able to study more because I just don't know how people are living in New York on 20K a year in the city. That said, this is where I want to go and work on the geography piece and mobility to watch how this sort of greases the wheels potentially for more mobility and where we can see where people move and do they move back and all of that. So I think these are all really good questions or good points, but we did control for geography in what you've seen so far today.
I'm giving you like 2 minutes to answer Tal's question, which
Speed
is
round.
Hawthorne effect. So basically, he's not interested in the question about the results, but more about the interpretation of the underlying mechanism, the idea that, these people who have been selected, right, then and they know that they're being observed. There's obviously some sort of impact that that's having.
Yeah, I mean it's obvious, I guess. I'm not sure how obvious it is. I mean, it's obvious hypothesis. I don't know if I can prove or reject it. I think it's an interesting one, especially if you go to like the difference between this and a universal basic income. Does the fact that you're singled out as a special part of society, it's not universal, make it more impactful? Because if everyone got it, oh, I don't care. It's not, there's no Hawthorne effect anymore because it's actually truly universal. I don't know. We can't say that from this. Will say though, again, from the qualitative and anecdotal evidence I've got, uh, the survey, we did interviews with a bunch of recipients also, and many of them would say things like, "This is really important to me. I feel recognized. I feel seen. I feel acknowledged." And so in that sense, a guaranteed income program that gave them $20 a month might be just as effective because a lot of these people, struggling artists, just really wanted to be recognized and acknowledged. And if they're being honest in their interviews, they really valued that. And that was strong motivation. And so if we're going to call that a Hawthorne effect, I can't prove it, but I bet we'd see something there. And I'm not sure that that's separate from the treatment effect of the program's intent anyway. Like we see
Yeah.
you. That's part of the goal. That's
And
part of the
agree.
package.
Yeah, and I agree, Tal, it would have been great if we could have had two different experimental groups. Unfortunately, we were called in as evaluators after the program was implemented, which is usually the case with program evaluation, but should not be.
Our cost of living one might get at that in some ways, but it
Yeah.
also run into the confounding thing that Neill says. The people with low cost of living are in the red part of the state, not the blue part, and who knows, other stuff going on. All right,
Yep.
what else? I
So
got a
Sarah's
minute.
class,
Oh yeah.
you mentioned that artists move toward more professional development and experimental approaches. I'm curious about whether you collected sample artworks as more qualitative indicators at baseline versus after 18 months of more economic stability, and what does art look like when people are feeling more of a sense of security? That's good.
Short answer is no, we didn't. On the front end, part of it, they weren't requiring that these artists even had artwork necessarily. If they had produced, and I mean, they were trying to be incredibly inclusive and not and lower the bar. And so it was really self-identifying as artists in a way. If you had an Instagram account, you're good. And so there wasn't really much of that required on the front end. It was not collected in a way that we could then compare. So we didn't. I would actually be tracking what's going on at Springboard for the arts. I think they're doing a lot more to pay attention to, like qualitatively, how has the artwork changed once you're in their program?
Yeah, and our partner did collect some artwork, so the Appalachian
Right.
State team did, but it wasn't a before and after.
Right. It was only post. Uh,
Yeah.
and this other question about art mediums costing more, we didn't account for the different sort of cost of doing the practice across different disciplines. We do have that information, and we haven't. I mean, we haven't accounted for it yet. We should. It's an interesting question. I like it. I'm gonna put that on my to-do lists. I think it's really an interesting part.
Great. Okay, great set of questions, and we're running out of time. So I'd just like to say thank you to Doug for this very nice overview of everything that's been going on with this program. I learned a lot, Doug, so it's neat to see what we've done over the past few years. So thank you.
Stay tuned for more. I think this is. I mean, there's other pieces. Of this like some of these people in this survey are really hard to get a hold of in surveys. They duck out and you can't find them. We found them because CRNY held a huge pile of cash out there, and these people came out of the woodwork. These are important people to learn from, and so I think that's some of the most important stuff we'll get from this is just learning about people who are otherwise invisible, regardless of the policy program behind it.
Yeah, agreed.
So stay tuned for more.
Yeah, stay tuned and please do join us for our last seminar for this spring, which will be on April 22nd, and it's with Jess Bone from University of College London, and she'll be talking about social prescribing. So hopefully we see you all back and happy to have you here today. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Should send me a copy of the transcript.
Yes, I will. It's big. Okay.
seemed like there was a lot of activity there today.
Yes. All right. All right. I'm going to jump off. That was
Okay.
really nice. That was,
Yeah.
I liked your slides. So send those over to me.
Okay. Yeah. Some of them you can't edit because ChatGPT screwed it up, but I rebuilt
Yeah,
most of them, so
that's
I've
really
seen.
nice. And then I also noticed that we didn't have a couple of papers up on the preprint site. So I'm putting in, I asked Rebecca to put up the professional development one.
Good.
Um, so we can put that one up and we could put the world development perspectives one up there too, as soon as I find it.
And if she takes a week to do it, we'll be able to put the cultural econ one up also.
Yeah, the new one, the older one, I mean,
Oh, right.
basically the revised version is already up there, but okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds
All right,
good.
cool.
All right,
See
thanks,
ya.
Doug. Bye.